All right, we better get started. We have a few things to cover. I was asked, evidently Real Presence Radio sent out a thing that I'm going to be on the radio on Thursday, which I've forgotten about, so I better make sure it's still on my calendar. I have no idea. It's sometime on Thursday, they told me. I think it's probably around 10. It's not this morning. I don't schedule things on Tuesday morning outside of Bible study. So if someone asks me, the answer on Tuesday morning is no. That's just the way it goes. The second thing for the Christmas party is, I think that if you are interested in bringing something, my goal isn't to prevent people from bringing things, but as I was visiting with one table, it's probably a couple of things. Number one, that Father isn't going to eat and keep everything because, sugar coma does exist and I'm not going to have it. So don't bring like a pile of stuff thinking I'm going to leave it all for the priest. Even though it's Christmas, a few desserts is okay, but lots of them won't get eaten. And I was thinking a little bit that next week with Thanksgiving, it might be nice to have a little bit of food. So I'll try and make something, or if some people want to bring something, you can let me know. Reach out to me. I wrote the next set of notes after this one. I don't know if we get through all of these today, it's going to be really exciting. I don't know that we will, but the next ones are at least well in progress. Today we cover a few additional things and then a bunch about Rome and Roman emperors. And then, if we get there, Ignatius of Antioch and St. Clement. One thing that I did want to ask, you'll see it on the top of the next set of notes, is I'm debating a little bit how much detail is useful for you. If you enjoy kind of digging through things at more depth, or you'd rather move through history more quickly. Anyone have thoughts on that they want to share? Depth? Anyone feel like we're moving too slow? We're getting stuck in the mud? Evie says yes. She's going to fight. Get ready. We are going to start moving a little bit more quickly in the sense that part of the challenge I'm realizing, and the book does this, which is a good explanation that should help you, is that there's so much to history that the author of our book just picks a theme and kind of explores that theme through a time period. So for instance, he talks about persecutions with St. Cyprian of Carthage. Carthage is a city in North Africa. Cyprian's a really famous guy. We will cover him. But the persecutions begin all the way back in the Roman world in the reign of Nero. And Nero is like in the 60s AD. And Cyprian of Carthage is in like 260 or 240 or somewhere around there. So, 200 years before that, there's still persecutions. But I'm understanding better why he does that, because it's so much like trying to drink from a fire hydrant that I feel like I'm drowning, which probably means you feel like you're underwater. And so it's a little bit of a challenge to align where the book is with where we are, because he's definitely like taking a piece of history or a theme and looking at it over time. And then he'll go back and he'll take a different theme and look at it over time. And I'm not quite sure how to integrate that as well as I'd like to. So just know that that's a little bit of a challenge. I tried to pull out like which chapters in the book kind of go with what we're talking about, and I will try to continue to do that. But like for the next set of handouts, if we get there today or if that's in a few weeks, you'll see that it says like chapter 7 and it's out of order. But it's because that's his chapter on persecution of Christians, and that is important to cover because we're going to start with it earlier after we talk about the history of Rome because the persecutions start basically right away. But even for us, once we start on persecutions, I'm just going to go all the way through the Roman persecutions. So the first one is the Neronian, and then the Decian in 250, and then the one in about 300 by Diocletian, sorry. Domitian is earlier. Diocletian is the worst one. He's in 300. That's called the Great Persecution. That's when most of the Christians die. But we're just going to cover it as a theme and as a batch. So it's like 300 years, but it's too hard to try and like do part of it and then go talk about these saints and then come back. And so when we get to persecution, we're going to cover persecution, and then we'll go back and we'll look at the martyrs and the lives of the martyrs. We have a few of them today because they show up as early Christian writings, so we'll get there. It's important to note that many of the first Christians were trying to be faithful Jews. And this is something that I never really learned in seminary, and I'm coming to appreciate now. There is a rockiness to the relationship between Judaism and Christianity that isn't as clean as we would like it to be. What do you follow? Many of the first Christians make the argument that you should follow Jewish law. Most of us are perfectly comfortable never thinking about Jewish law more than, a millisecond in time. And that's different, and that's okay. It's not that the church was wrong in her decision, but it's just like we have to appreciate some of these historical things because they lend us valuable points of history, but also inspiration, that our faith can be richer. Maybe we've left behind too much of Judaism, and by rediscovering some of the Jewishness of Christianity, we can recover a greater sense of connection with Jesus. Because Jesus lived his entire life as a faithful Jew. And so there's Jewish things that are really important for Christian life. And much of what we have in the church, even for instance, our liturgy, is founded upon stuff that Jewish people did in the temple. The biggest difference is we change the sacrifice of animals for the bread and wine from Jesus and the consecration. But we follow much of temple liturgy. When we talk about the monks, the early monks basically took temple services and made them Christian. And so they started praying the Psalms throughout the day. And that was where the Liturgy of the Hours came from. And there's all these developments that are really, really Jewish. And I think it's great, we don't have to be afraid of that. That's not a bad thing. The big question of the New Testament is not Christianity versus Judaism. I would argue it's where salvation comes from. The big question of the early Christians wasn't, is Judaism bad? It's, does Judaism save people? And the answer is no. The blood of bulls and goats, the sacrificial system of Judaism, could not achieve salvation. That took the blood of God, because only God can forgive sins. The blood of animals doesn't forgive sins. So God comes himself. But because of this conflict between Judaism and Christianity, and because of the polemical debate, we have this camp, you have that camp, and the separation, Christianity lost a lot of its Jewish flavor. And that may not have been a good thing. Sort of like in the Protestant Reformation, if we ever hope of getting there, the polemical debate between the Catholics and the Protestants, the idea that Catholics have sacraments and liturgy and saints and the Protestants have the Bible, is bad. That's a bad way to do it. Because as Catholics, we should have the Bible too. There's nothing in Protestantism that's good that shouldn't be a part of Catholicism. There's lots of parts that aren't good, and we can talk about those, but it's like that polemical debate wasn't good. And so many of you grew up in an era where that polemical debate was sort of accepted as part of life. Most of you grew up not reading the scriptures because that was for the priest to do, because it was bad. You might fall into heresy and all of those things. That was bad. That's not good. That was a corruption of the truth of the Catholic Church. Now, it's never lost on the part of saints, and there's documents that talk about it, but by and large, the experience of people in the pews, that had been lost. And I would say it's about the same for this Jewish debate. So it's good to wrestle with, and this is something that to a certain extent you have to go against some of the tradition a little bit, people like St. Thomas Aquinas are really pessimistic about Jewish stuff. And you can agree with him, and that's fine. But, for instance, if you would choose to keep Jewish dietary laws, not because you believe it's salvation, but because it's a diet that you like, does that mean you're instantly on the road toward hell because you're rejecting salvation in Christ? I would argue no. We've been able to disconnect that in the modern time. If you follow a vegan diet, if you follow a vegetarian diet, I would say that diet doesn't relate to salvation very much at all. St. Thomas Aquinas would argue that differently. He's a saint, I'm not. You can believe him, and that's okay. I won't be offended. But he was still caught up in part of that polemical thing that happens very much in Europe in the Middle Ages. Jewish ritual worship and sacrifices are what changed the most. Christianity clearly makes a break with Judaism and temple sacrifices. And the problem was really made a lot easier because the Romans destroyed the temple. And once there's no more temple, there's no more Jewish sacrifices either. The law, the Jewish law, is good and holy. We don't reject the Old Testament. That's not part of what we are about. Christianity is more of an evolution of Judaism, not a rejection. I think that's important to emphasize. Christianity is something that grows out of Judaism. But like Jesus says, probably not a yod. Yod is the smallest letter in the Jewish language. In Greek, it's translated as not an iota of the law will, what does he say, disappear, that it will not pass away. That's kind of the language that he uses that our modern translations use. But he probably used the Hebrew word for yod, which is the smallest letter in the Hebrew language, and it tends to disappear. It's almost invisible in some of their words, even though it's assumed to be there. One thing that you should know about the book too, so the book author is Catholic. I think he's a good Catholic. He's on a bunch of papal commissions, and he's a good man. So I don't take this as outright criticism of him, but there's times where he writes from the perspective of power and worldly authority, and that has always kind of rubbed me the wrong way. It feels a little bit like sandpaper. But it's probably true. I'm probably on the naive end, and I like to believe that Christians are better than that, but there's wisdom in it, but it still bugs me a little bit. So just know that. That's one of the struggles. It's also published by Yale University Press. And so there's times where he promotes this sort of official U.S. academic position, which I would call academic skepticism, which basically discounts sources in the liturgy. It discounts traditional Christian sources of stuff. It discounts lots of these things. And with good reason sometimes. I mean, they make it kind of legendary. There's times where it's like, God took, this person to heaven in a flaming chariot and flung them like 800 miles away. Could that happen? Yes, it's possible. Is it likely that it happened quite as often as they say? No, it's not likely. They lionize some of the martyrs, so one of the things is martyrs are holy and martyrs love Jesus, and so when they're on their way to their execution, they're singing and they're praying and they're loving people and they're not sad at all and they never have fear and that's probably a little bit legendary. Now, can it happen? Yes. Is it a grace of God? Certainly. But did it happen in every case? It's unlikely. So you just have to know that there is a strain of academic skepticism, and some of it is probably valid. The old idea, for instance, that St. Patrick chased all the snakes out of Ireland isn't exactly true. Ireland has a few snakes, and there's not a lot of evidence. I mean, you could look at, all kinds of fossil-y stuff and that kind of stuff, and you can get lost in it. Now, part of it is a commentary on chasing Satan out of Ireland. And in that sense, it's pretty true. Patrick was kind of a bold guy, and he knocked some people on the head and, went after the Druids with a stick. But but it's like the problem of taking things too literally. St. Francis of Assisi probably becomes the most legendary lionized saint of the Catholic Church. So how many of the stories are true? It's hard to say. it tells the story of him preaching to the fish and preaching to the birds and talking to a wolf to stop it from attacking a village. He probably did some of those things. I genuinely believe in miracles. But was he doing that every day? Maybe? He jumps into a rose bush and the thorns all fall off because he was tempted, and God sort of says, you weren't tempted so far that you sinned. Is it possible? Sure, I would very much agree. But Christianity has this desire to make things legendary. We see it in the modern world in bad ways. So people and their faults are basically paved over. George Washington is the great leader of the American Revolution and the sterling example of everything that an American president should be. He might have been, but that's very much a legendary account. He had become a legendary man, and that's a cultural thing. It's not a bad thing. Part of the stories of saints are meant to inspire us, and we hold them up as examples. But it's okay to have a martyr who's afraid to die. It's okay to have someone who's being burned alive and they actually feel it. That's not immoral. And so you have to recognize that these strands of challenge are in history, and it's not that I want to stand in judgment of it all, because I can't. But just to be honest, that is every little part of it true? It's hard to say. There's things that are very, very hard to wrestle with. One of the great stories in the time of iconoclasm in the East, so 700s, 800s, 900s, the eastern part of the Roman Empire becomes iconoclastic. They start destroying images. You can't make images of God. So one of the stories is people wanted to save this icon of Mary, so they threw it in the ocean. And then it floated across the ocean and came to a place in Greece. And then it stood up and it was being carried by angels and saints in procession up to a monastery in Greece where it would be safe. That's possible, but it's a little bit like, did it happen 10,000 times? I kind of doubt it. I don't know. So it's just, I think you just need to know that this kind of background is out there. And it's not that we want to judge it all, but you can have a healthy dose of skepticism and still believe in miracles. Like, those don't have to be polemical and mutually exclusive. You could say, is every story true in exactly the way it's told? Well, probably not. But is every story false just because it's told by Christians? Absolutely not. No, not at all. So, we dive into the Roman world. Couple of things about Rome. So Rome originally is a city-state. If you remember the Greek city-states, they're like small towns with a bunch of fields around them. That was how Rome started. It's the Latium people on the western side of the Italian peninsula near the modern-day city of Rome. It rises out of Etruscan culture. The Etruscans were predecessors. The early time of Rome in the 600s BC, that's the height of Greek power and authority. And so Rome is kind of in the background, but Rome is growing. One of the major pieces of Rome, you have to understand this to make sense out of the later persecutions, is the Roman civitas, which means like city, citizen, like that kind of theme. All of those words in English come out of this word. This is like a foundational Roman concept. People are more than an individual. They're citizens in a society. They're part of a larger whole. So you're not just a person from this village outside of Rome. You are Roman. And being Roman is more than being from the city of Rome. Being Roman is as much a mentality. It's an idea. It's an ideal. Roman is to be virtuous. Roman is to be heroic. The Romans were reading things like the epics of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey and Aeneas and those kind of things. And then they have their own poet named Virgil who writes their own national epic narrative, because when you want to build an empire, you have an epic narrative of your founder who's a god. And so they write their own. And I think it's He becomes named, is it Romulus? He comes out of Aeneas or something. Anyway, they take one of these Greek characters who's from Troy, and they sail him across the ocean to where Rome is, and he becomes the founder of Rome. Again, is it possible? Very certainly. The Greeks did stuff like that. But it's also very convenient that to have an empire, you need a national narrative, and so they write a national narrative. But you are citizens of the city. And citizens have a role in society and responsibilities, what is expected of them. This is the development of much more of the modern culture of government and how it works. Being a citizen of Rome is very important. Now, it's not perfect. There's many fewer citizens of Rome than citizens of the United States. 30% of the population was slaves. A huge percentage after that was freedmen. They weren't citizens. And then citizens, you're already talking about 60%. Citizens would be less than 40%. But to be a Roman citizen is a big deal. And citizens have responsibilities. Citizens have rights. But that goes together. And there's no real way out of it. If you're a Roman citizen, you have duties, and those duties are civic, like participation in civic festivals. You're there or you're dead, or you're not a citizen. So when the governor declares a celebration to Zeus on the 2nd of January, you show up. And it doesn't matter what your boss at work says, because this is what's expected of a Roman. And you are a Roman. And you have to kind of feel that, because that thing is going to play into Christian persecution. You can see the setup, because what happens eventually is that they say to be Roman is to do those things. And so if you're Christian and you refuse to do those things, you're no longer Roman. And once you're no longer Roman, you don't have rights. And once you don't have rights, people can take advantage of that. So that idea becomes a huge thing. Roman religion is kind of a funky thing. The Greeks were a very religious people, like religion. Romans are a little bit more, they worship powers, natural powers. It's naturalistic. The Romans weren't really interested in the sense of civil duty, whether you believed in anything you did or not. That didn't matter. What mattered is you did it. So you attended the celebrations of Jupiter, and you poured out the offerings, and you ate sacrificed animals. They don't really give a darn whether you believe a lick of it or not. That's not important. It's important because it's a Roman duty. And again, you can kind of see the setup. Like, this is how religion in ancient Rome worked. And religion was everywhere in a way that we, compared to, if you would compare modern day societies to ancient ones, they would convict us all of being atheists and kill us. We would all be condemned as atheists and die. Because we live in a world where lots of stuff that we do, we sort of make a choice and we do it. But in Rome, it's like you want to build a house, you have to ask the gods. You want to do this, you have to ask the gods. You want to marry someone, you have to ask the gods. And that always involves these religious ceremonies, and they sacrifice birds and do all these weird things. We'll talk about Roman religion more a little bit later. But it was everywhere. Every facet of life is impacted. This is part of what is hard for Paul and the early Christians. They're like, well, you can't eat meat sacrificed to idols. And the Christians were like, there's no meat that's not sacrificed to idols. That doesn't exist, because when you're killing chickens, you don't kill them at home, you go kill them at the temple. And the priest does it for you. And then they give you all your chickens back, and then you butcher chickens. That's how they did it. And so religion and life, it wasn't like now where you can go to church on Sunday and then kind of ignore it the rest of the week. I mean, that's not a good way to live, but you can do that. In ancient Rome, it ain't like that. It's like the air that you breathe is religion. And the Roman problem is that they don't care whether you believe it. You just have to do it. And being an atheist, being convicted of atheism is a capital crime. You don't get to be an atheist anywhere. You at least have to sort of say, well, okay, I believe in the gods, Jupiter this and Jupiter that. You can write all the naturalistic treatises you want, but if you don't have belief in the gods, they kill you. or they don't publish them, and then they burn down your house, and then they kill all your relatives, and then they take your money and give it to the government. Like, they're not nice about it. It's very different. Roman religion and pagan religion in general is fatalistic. This is another foundational concept that Christianity militates against. This is part of the reason why divination is wrong. Fatalism is the idea that your life is governed by fate. So your fate is in the stars, your fate is in the tarot cards, your fate is anywhere other than God. Christianity believes in freedom. You were created with free will. Free will and fate are opposed. And if you listen, you'll hear people say this actually. Well, it's like anything I do, I'm just fated to end up this way. It's not going to work out. Fatalism is rampant. It's rampant in paganism. It happens all the time in the modern world. We're always trying to control our destiny, to control what comes next, to control hereafter. And people have it. It gets a lot of religious expressions. And the Catholic Church is very, very clear. These are violations of the first or second commandment, depending on which list you go by. But this is a violation of the sovereignty of God, that God alone is the master of history and the master of the future. But fatalism is very, very hopeless. It's a very, very poor way to live because you don't matter. Your choices don't matter because everything has been written in the stars before you were born. Everything is in your genes. Everything is in genetics. You can put all kinds of stuff in that spot. And Christianity says no. Fundamentally, foundationally, no. You can choose to believe in Jesus, and that choice is foundational and fundamental for your life. So this is where it gets kind of funky because there's other Roman religions in a sense, and they still sort of have to profess Roman paganism, but then kind of don't believe it at all. Stoicism is one of them. So Stoicism becomes a religion of philosophy and necessity. This is like naturalistic determinism, it would be called. So like everything's a lever. You poke the lever, the thing goes up. And everything in life can be reduced to these things that happen as consequences of other things. Everything is cause and effect. They have a life of practical details. They talk about practical virtue, but it's like you should practice piety because that's a good thing to do. You should practice piety. You should do these things. You should live a life of virtue because that's just a better way to live. That's a better way to press the levers. But again, you don't have a lot of freedom. You don't have a lot of choice. It's not all that interesting as a way of life. Christianity will argue against the Stoics. Platonism. Oh, good old Plato. This is another one that you kind of have to remember because this is going to show up in Christianity in a big way as soon as we talk about the Gnostics, and is weird. So Plato, the biggest distinction is that Plato has a world of forms and a world of matter. The forms are what things are. So bread or trees or chairs or books or people, that's all a form. And then there's matter, the material stuff that makes it up. And so the things that you see are form plus matter. But in Plato, there's this strong tendency, form good, intellect good, mind, mental stuff good, matter bad. That is going to show up again. It shows up in the dualistic origin of the world. You see, part of it is an explanation for how things work. Why do you have good desires and do bad things? The Platonic answer is you have good desires because you have a soul which is oriented toward heaven, and you have matter which is bad and stuck on things of this world. And your matter and your soul don't have to interact very much. And so you have this is called dualism, that there's two principles. It shows up in creation. So Christianity takes it, there's a good God in the New Testament and there's a bad God in the Old Testament. Good God in the New Testament is happy with you, wants to save you. Bad God in the Old Testament is mad at you and wants to send you to hell. Or, in some cases, there's a good God, Jesus, and there's a bad God, Satan. And the world and material things was made by Satan because it's material and therefore it's bad. And so Jesus came like to Satan's world that he made and sort of grabbed people in their souls and wants to bring them to heaven. This will cause messes. Believe me, it sounds kind of weird, but this becomes a predominant religious system of much of the world at one point. If you want Plato's system, the best thing that you can do is to read one of the most famous works, one of the most necessary works of Western literature, Plato's Republic, which is a fantastic political commentary. It's rather hilarious that he says that democracy is evil and it's doomed to fail. He says the only hope for government is an aristocracy governed by people who are virtuous. It's rather interesting to think about his governmental stuff in Plato's Republic. Lots of Catholic philosophers and podcasters and those kind of people read it. If you really want a good take on it, look for Peter Kraft. He's a fantastic philosopher. He teaches at Boston College, but he's not strange. He's really, really, really good. So, matter and form, remember that about Plato. We will come back, I promise. The Roman Republic, the res publica, this becomes a big deal. So this is when 509 traditional start. The Romans sort of do this Greek thing. They have democracy. They elect a senate. The Romans are paranoid about one person being in charge and taking power and becoming a dictator. That is anti-Roman, anti-civitas, like everything that they stand for. So they set up a system that sounds good in principle and really causes problems. So there's the people. They're divided into different classes. There's plebeians and patricians, and there's classes in the patricians, they're called equites in Latin. What's the English-y thing of it? Equestrian. The equestrian section is below the senatorial section, and there's a bunch of Roman stratification that becomes important as well. But they're paranoid about this. So their government system is that from the Senate, 2 consuls are elected who share power, and the 2 consuls get to hold office for a year. And you can only have power and authority longer than a year in time of war, and it has to be explicitly authorized by the Senate. Which sounds good. That's a good way of preventing dictators because no one has all of the power. Most of it's vested in the Senate, and it changes every year. But that has issues. So the famous thing about the Roman sort of Senate, the Roman government, is SPQR. Senatus Populusque Romani, the Senate and the people of Rome. If you go to Italy, they stamped this everywhere. It's on pillars, it's on foundation stones, it's SPQR all over. They have it on their manhole covers and all kinds of places. The Senate and the people of Rome. This was the idea that the Senate acts in the name of the people. And again, you can kind of feel that bigger than national boundary. You're not just from Greece. You're not just from Thrace. It's a region across that's on the Dalmatian coast across the Adriatic from Italy.